The Fed is preparing to do something that they don't do outside of a recession. Now, is it because that inflation actually isn't under wraps, or is it because of the pressure that Trump is putting on everybody? But first, let's listen into what Scott Bessent interestingly said on traditional media on what he thinks the Fed should have done based on past results. Now, let's listen in to what he said exactly.
I think what we could see is that, let's first of all, what if the BLS data had been the higher quality and we'd had those numbers, Jonathan? So if we'd seen those numbers in May, in June, I suspect we could have had rate cuts in June and July.
So he's suggesting here that the data that they are getting is just faulty. It is bad. I mean, I've honestly been saying this on this channel for quite some time that we're using survey data, we're using emails, we're using mail, stuff that people aren't honestly checking on a daily basis to make decisions that have a lot of standing on the over economic standing of the United States. And as the global reserve currency, we need to get these things more up to date. Trump has been saying it. All of these people have been saying that the data that we've been collecting has been very weird. But what Bessent is suggesting is very drastic, right? He's suggesting a 50 basis point cut, which we normally do not see in a quote unquote healthy economy. And I'm going to dive into why the signs that are showing potentially one of the worst economies that we've had since we've gotten off the gold standard. But first, this 50 basis point cut, I don't think many people are listening too closely to what he is saying, because this could have cut it in June. There's been a foundational issue in the central bank and all of these different things. And then the US and China relations, he's emphasized that they're solving several variables with China and that Trump has an excellent relationship with Xi Jinping. So there's legal challenges with the tariffs, and Bessent mentioned that he is paying personally to renovate the Treasury office, allegedly, right? But this is very unique because when is the last time we've seen a 50 basis point cut, or ever, right? We've seen one 1991, 1992 with 3 50-point basis cuts to save a recession. Then we had the dot-com bubble in the early recession in the 2000s. We had economic weakness coming out of the dot-com bubble in the 2000s. And then the global financial crisis in 2008, and then the COVID cerveza sickness emergency in 2020. So this would be the 6th time in history that we see this drastic of a cut. Granted, it's only twice the size of a normal cut, right? I mean, we get 25 basis cuts all the time, right? Whenever the Fed is cutting or is raising interest rates, it's almost a guarantee that they're going to lower interest rates at a certain point in time shortly thereafter. But with all of this, right, the 50 basis point cut that they are talking about is drastic and twice as big. And granted, a bunch of other central banks around the globe do this, but not the United States. So Trump has been calling for a 3-point rate cut. He wants rates down and down quickly. Scott Bessent is echoing that sentiment, but doing it at a little bit more of an even keel pace, asking for, just 50 basis point cuts. So this is honestly very big and drastic, and Bessent continuing to do this is absolutely huge, right? Because lowering the basis point cuts and having all of these things come to light, well, they're blasting all of this stuff, right? I mean, they're openly just ripping on the Fed and telling them, hey, they are doing things incorrectly. He revised all of this revised data that we see after the fact just points to the poor collection of the data, right? Show me the data. Show me the data that everything is doing well and dandy. In reality, it is not, right? And we always see these things come out, and then, a couple weeks later, this data gets revised. Now, after the revisions take place, everybody starts to freak out like, oh my God, why did this happen? Why is this looking this way? But when we're looking at these revisions, you got to keep a close eye on this, right? They could have been cutting back in June and July, had it updated figures earlier, right? He remarked shortly after the fresh inflation data showing CPI rose 0.2%, while core excluding food or energy, which I cackle when I see these things, right? How can you look at CPI and say, we are going to exclude food and energy from the consumer price index? What is the consumer? The consumer needs to eat and the consumer needs to keep the lights on. I mean, at this point in time, if you don't have internet, how are you even working? That is my question. I mean, it's absolutely crazy that we see these things get excluded from the consumer price index. I mean, insane that they even have that as a sentence. But either way, excluding that, it still increased 0.3%. So goods and prices remain subdued despite some tariff hikes. Now, the crazy thing about all of this is that even though we have a lackluster economy and that the Fed is screaming to cut 50 basis points, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, is screaming for the Fed to cut 50 basis points, the S&P 500 is climbing and we're seeing all-time highs. The market is doing outstanding. So we're getting this growing disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street, and it's continuing to increase that gap farther and farther. And people are just essentially looking at all of this and saying, hey, wait a minute. I feel like there is something up here. I feel like there is some drastic difference. Now, with that, right? The rally reflects expectations that the Fed is going to cut at least 25 basis points. And I mean, in 35 days, according to the CME Group, which for all accounts, I believe is fairly accurate. Well, they look like it's a 99.9% chance that they are going to cut interest rates. And now they are looking at a 0.1% chance that they are going to cut by 50 basis points at the next meeting. Now, this is absolutely crazy. It's almost a certainty that they are going to cut interest rates. It's just by how much. At least 35 days out from this meeting. And for those of you guys who know and have been watching this live chat with me for quite some time, I mean, I've been tracking this and we haven't seen anything over the 30 to 35% range. So seeing it at a 99.9% chance we're going to cut at least 25 basis points is astronomical. So I'm going to keep diving into some of the potential signs. But before I do, make sure you guys are hitting that like button and subscribing. I know we've got the most I've ever seen in here. We got 11 of you guys coming in here. So I appreciate you guys coming in. And we're going to dive into more on how historic we are seeing this right now, because we are seeing the worst start to the dollar since 1973. And for those of you guys who know, WTF happened in 1971, right? We went off the gold standard in 1971. So shortly after we went off the gold standard, we had the worst start to the dollar shortly after that, right? Well, 2025, what the hell is going on now, right? I thought everything was supposed to be all fine and dandy, but it's been the worst start since 1973. The Dixie dropped by 10.8%. The greenback fell by 14.4% on the Swiss franc, 13.8 against the euro, 9.7 against the British pound. Market currencies surged. So all these other fiat currencies are starting to do well against the dollar, and we're starting to see these massive amounts of cracks come in, right? So this is some issues that we're going to see persist as we got going forward, right? But what else are we seeing, right? The FX effect. The S&P 500 priced in the euro. People are looking at it that way. The euro is climbing to its strongest level since September 2021, which obviously, we saw the cerveza sickness during that time. And then we have the best performing stocks. The dollar's down by, 30% or 10%, 10.8% during the first half of this year. And we've got stocks up almost doubling within a year. Palantir up nearly 80%. Energy. Homet up 74%. I mean, these things like are absolutely crazy at the beginning of the years. And now with all of this, when we got the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent coming out and just essentially ripping on everybody, well, this is what we get. Now people are worried about the Fed's independence from what we are from everything, right? Are they going to be politically agnostic? It doesn't seem like that is going to be the case anymore, right? The Fed looks like they are essentially just in for some trash here, right? So, as Karmic in the chat is saying, this is what happens when you fire the messenger. And, Trump did fire the BLS messenger who, is in charge of all of this data collection. Powell is one of 12 voters. That is true. But he's the face, essentially, right? So, I mean, Trump's coming out and calling him too slow Powell, coming at him left and right, doing all of these different things. And it's leading to people just essentially thinking that the Fed is not agnostic anymore, right? Deutsche Bank, 16% of participants believe the Fed operates with full independence, while 25% think political influence is pushing the central bank towards cutting rates. I mean, look at this, right? So the Swiss franc has appreciated against the dollar by nearly 50% over the last 20 years, right? Does Switzerland have that much of a better economy, right? Lon is saying that, hey, the BLS commissioner was fired for cause. Maybe so. But what I do think is that Trump and all of them were hating on the data that they were putting out. And I mean, for better or for worse, the data has not been solid. And I've been screaming from my lungs on this very channel that the data that we use to make these political decisions is just terrible. There's no way, shape around it. I mean, at this point in time, I mean, how many of you guys fill out a government survey? I'd love to hear in the chat how many of you guys honestly do that. Because as a guy, I mean, hey, I'm a millennial, 31 years old. I've never filled one out, never have, probably never will, right? I'm home barely any. And so with all of this, right? I mean, you're killing the messenger, but we need to propose a better system to collect all this data to make more educated decisions. And so, hey, fire the messenger because she's not doing a good enough job in order to collect this data or change up how she's collecting the data. But the Swiss franc, I mean, is Switzerland really that more efficient? In August of 2011, it peaked. But will the heavy use of its balance sheet to go for negative interest rates? I mean, it's like absolutely just humming here. Like we're almost reaching a Swiss franc all-time high. And we got IBM surpassing its long-standing capitulation ceiling. The turnaround is now from AI. I mean, we're seeing some crazy things. And of course, we see the Bitcoin ETFs absolutely launch and take off, right? So all of these people are looking at the Dixie, right? I mean, we've got the Dixie plummeting today, up at 97.74, so 97 and 3/4. I mean, for those, like I said, like we've been watching this for a very close period of time. And we saw the Dixie go to 97. Then we also saw the Dixie skyrocket and shoot up like crazy up to about 100, where, you would like to see it. And then from there, it just absolutely plummeted. So we're seeing just the effects of the Dixie, the volatility, something that we've never seen before. Lon is saying Rasmussen reports 8% unemployment, not the 4% in July. Hey, I mean, I think that if you look at, I like to look at Govflation because govflation.com shows these old government headlines, the real return, the GDP. If you look at the differences in the unemployment numbers, right, they're nearly double from what they report. And this is from when they changed how they report the unemployment numbers in 1994. So changing the data, okay, you know what? Now you get to report different numbers, but I mean, reporting these numbers, people still feel the effects. And as All Nighter Hider is saying, I mean, there's always revisions in all of this, right? So, I mean, you see this gap getting fixed bigger and bigger. I mean, it's just essentially just this gap is not closing. And what we are seeing is we're seeing the S&P 500 just absolutely explode, and it's not going anywhere, right? The S&P 500 is going to continue to hit more and more all-time highs. And as this market is going to keep humming along, well, you know, people pointing to the data and saying, hey, the data is incorrect, they killed the messenger, all of these different things. All right, I get it. But like when you have the data showing, all right, good data, how often are we calling for 50 basis point cuts? I mean, I showed you guys, it's only during recessions that we see this. And during recessions, we haven't seen as weak of a dollar as we are seeing now. So all of this change, all of this manipulation that is going on is absolutely crazy. And honestly, this is the most I've seen in a live chat with you guys. I think we've seen 15 at one point in time. So I really appreciate you guys coming in. Please subscribe and hit those bell notifications so you guys know when I'm going live. You can join me. And I'm going to be covering this very closely because we've got some crazy political theater going on. So make sure you guys are hitting that like and hitting that subscribe button, telling a friend to tell a friend, and I'll catch you guys all at the next one.